gives a fuck about an Oxford comma? By Great 78.
Who gives a fuck about an Oxford comma? I've seen those English dramas too. They're cruel. So if there's any other way to spell the word, it's fine with me. With me.
Chapter 17. Stay. I missed you. Hermione. Monday, October 4th, 1999. Pegwater Flat 307, Christchurch College, Oxford, England. On her first day of classes at Oxford, Hermione awoke from a lovely dream about last New Year's Eve, perhaps the best variation of it that her mind had come up with yet. It wasn't a dream that her brain allowed itself to indulge in often, but after the events of Saturday morning, 2 days before, apparently her subconscious could not help itself. The dream started out much like the reality of last New Year's Eve night. Draco had stepped out of his bedroom to go to the party at Gryffindor Tower, looking alarmingly dashing, and her face had burned as she led the two Slytherins upstairs from the 8th year common room. They'd toasted together with some of Theo's family liquor, and Draco had looked at her with blazing silver eyes over the rim of his glass as they drank together. The pool of liquid heat low in her belly bubbled like a lit cauldron, as it was sometimes wont to do around him. Later that night, walking back to their common room, the two of them had fallen back from Theo and Romilda. Well beyond buzzed, she'd leaned against the wall, smiling lazily up at Draco. He hovered at a similar level of delightfully tipsy, and both of their usual defences were down. At the time, Hermione remembered thinking that the party in the Gryffindor common room wouldn't have been nearly as much fun with Ron as it had been with Draco. Logically, she knew she should have felt guiltier for thinking that way. She and Ron were dating, despite his lack of an invite to the Burrow for Christmas holidays, and his hurried departure back on Boxing Day. The two of them had talked about a future together, marriage, and children. But the flutter in her lower belly when the blonde Slytherin was about was becoming harder and harder to deny. Ron had only visited her twice in the autumn term, despite her open-door invitation. Every time they flu-called each other, he'd come up with an excuse to cut the conversation short. Hermione had written him letters that had gone unanswered. She knew she might not have been the best girlfriend, but Ron was far from the best boyfriend. And that night, in the corridor with Draco, her drunken self teetered dangerously close to pulling the other wizard to her, to letting his hands wander wherever they wanted, something that her sober self would have pretended to be horrified about. When they'd stopped in the corridor, Draco had leaned against the wall, bracing himself on either side of her, caging her in with his strong arms. He'd leaned forward ever so slightly. She thought then that he might kiss her. Her body longed for it, in fact. His smouldering silver eyes, his blonde hair looking almost dishevelled from the drink he'd consumed. She nearly let it happen. But at the last moment, she'd physically wrenched herself away from him, guilty thoughts of Ron crowding her brain. Draco had walked her back to bed, back in the dormitories, and she'd embarrassed herself by burrowing into the crook of his arm, leaning against him far more than her sober self would have approved of. His warm body through his Oxford shirt had smelled divine, and she could feel his muscles working against her cheek through the fabric. Spending time with Draco had been nothing short of wonderful all night. And in that moment, Hermione felt as though she was living on borrowed minutes, that peculiar space between 2 years on the calendar that did not seem to exist in ordinary time. In a split-second decision that wasn't typical for her, Hermione decided to throw caution to the wind. When she and Draco reached the side of her bed, she had smiled up at him so invitingly, holding both of his hands in hers to keep him there, next to her. For a moment she thought she saw the same desire reflected in his gaze. But then Malfoy dropped his eyes, gritting his teeth as though in pain. Sensing his impending rejection, she dropped his hands and turned away from him, pretending to fall asleep immediately. "What were you thinking?" Her inner voice berated her drunken, idiot self. But then, as she was lying there contemplating her poor life choices, Draco Malfoy had done something so tender, so gentle. He had taken off her shoes and covered her carefully with the duvet, tucking it in just so around her shoulders. The earnest sweetness of the gesture made her heart melt and caused her mind to reconsider the whole idea of her and Malfoy. She had nearly allowed herself to be overcome by her sexual desires. Before that moment, she had only imagined a quick shag with the man, never to be repeated or spoken of again. She had not expected such sweet intimacy from a wizard like Draco, and it made her mind race with possibilities. Now, every so often, her dreams would rewrite the events of that night just a bit. Sometimes she allowed that kiss in the corridor, imagining what it could have led to. Sometimes the dream version of herself pulled him down onto the bed with her, and they snogged each other senseless. And then sometimes, like in last night's dream, Malfoy had eagerly climbed into the bed with her and fucked her into the mattress. Hermione smiled to herself, even as her core ached between her thighs. She was certain that this particular variation of the dream had been brought on by Malfoy's appearance early Saturday morning at her bedroom door, fresh out of the shower, searching for a pair of briefs. God, she knew he was fit, but she had no idea that he looked like that under those Oxford shirts and jumpers. Groaning to herself, she pushed herself up, trying to ignore the stickiness between her legs. She cocked an ear and heard the sounds of the running shower, then checked her watch. Sod it all to hell, she had to be in the advisor's office in 20 minutes. There was no time for a shower, even if the toilet wasn't occupied. She dug out a fresh pair of knickers, pausing only for a moment to admire the photograph of what she now thought of as her own personal incubus, buried inside the drawer. Several freshening charms later, she stepped out of the bedroom door just as Malfoy was lifting a hand to knock, demanding a pair of his pants. His wet hair clung to his forehead, and Hermione could not help but greedily breathe in the woodsy scent of his cologne. "Sorry, Malfoy, I have to dash. I'm off to see my advisor. I need to get there before our first class," she said, as she turned sideways to get out of his way and head for the front door. "Miss Perkins." For some reason, Malfoy's demeanour seemed angrier than usual at his words. Not much of a morning person, she supposed. Yes," Hermione answered distractedly, her face heating as she tried not to look back at Malfoy's half-dressed body. Her dream from only a few minutes before had been from the perspective of sitting astride him, touching that very chest as his cock had moved within her. The images and sensations ran through her mind in a difficult-to-ignore level of detail. Without another word, she stumbled to the door and hurried breathlessly into the corridor outside.
"Ah, Miss Granger, do come in. We here at Oxford just like to meet with all of the new witches and wizards briefly before they get started with classes here," the woman said airily, lifting her chin to look down at Hermione, even though she remained seated as the younger witch entered. Miranda Perkins gave the impression of being the kind of person who judged quickly and harshly, tearing down others to feel better about herself. She forcibly reminded Hermione of Stephanie, the reception at her parents' dental practice. Stephanie enjoyed telling others about her unfortunate lot in life. According to the woman, everyone else's good fortune was the reason for her own personal failures. Advisor Perkins grumbled as she dug through the paperwork on her desk. Hermione wondered why the woman did not simply summon it. Finally, she moved aside the largest cup of coffee that Hermione had ever seen, locating the papers she was searching for. There was a damp coffee ring upon them that the woman chose not to vanish. "Yes, Miss Hermione," Hermione helpfully supplied. The woman gave her the briefest of ugly looks before nodding curtly. "Yes, Hermione. Is that a family name?" Hermione could tell that this woman did not care, one way or the other, about her answer. "Yes," she lied. "How lovely." Miss Perkins smiled, with an expression that said that Hermione's answer was anything but. Miss Perkins, I hate to be a bother, but my first class begins in about 30 minutes, and I wanted to be sure to have time to choose the best seat. Your letter only said that you needed to see me briefly?" Hermione asked in her most civil tone. Something about the woman did not sit well with her, and she wanted to be done with this meeting. "Of course. Well," the squat administrator said, now speaking as though from a memorized speech, "we at Oxford require magical folk to wear this pin at all times, as a discreet form of identification. It is this pin that will allow you access to the magical buildings on the campus that non-magical folk cannot gain access to." Hermione frowned. There had been nothing indicating this in the paperwork that she'd received from the admissions offices back in March. She told this to Advisor Perkins, who grimaced. "Be that as it may, it is a rule, Miss Granger. I am aware that you have a history of breaking rules, but these do apply to everyone." Hermione breathed loudly through her nose before tamping down her quick peevishness. "I apologize for being so obtuse, Advisor Perkins, but I know that I read somewhere in the rules that a wand was all that was needed to gain access to the magical buildings." It had been in Rule 3, Paragraph B, but even Hermione, in all of her swottiness, knew better than to quote the rules and regulations of this woman's school back at her. "Miss Granger!" Advisor Perkins's tone was frigid now, and Hermione closed her mouth. "I have been asked by Minister Shacklebolt himself that you wear this pin. As you well know, the Ministry of Magic has gotten word of numerous threats in the past year, since all of that business last spring. These pins are additionally made to alert the authorities if something were to happen to you, so you will wear it, and you will do so gladly." All of that business last spring? Hermione schooled her look of surprise. Presumably this woman was a witch. At the very least, she knew of the existence of magic. Was she entirely unfamiliar with the extent of the Wizarding War? The younger woman was silent for only a moment, before nodding her agreement. "All right. Thank you. Will there be anything else this morning?" Miss Perkins's sudden smile was almost as unnerving as her earlier tone had been. "No, that's generally everything. Now, this pin, you may transfigure it, or even disillusion it, if you're able. But please keep it on your person, perhaps attached to a favourite necklace, or even affix it to your wand." Hermione reluctantly attached the pin to the delicate gold charm bracelet that her parents had given her for her 10th birthday. "And by all means, please come and see me if you encounter any problems this term, Miss Granger. We are here to help all witches and wizards at Oxford, regardless of their birth." Hermione had already closed the door behind her in an effort to get away from the annoying woman, before the advisor's words caught up to her. Regardless of their birth. She sighed. It would not be the first nor the last time that she had encountered the ingrained mistrust that the wizarding world had for Muggleborns. She had hoped to avoid it here, though. "Is she free?" a young man asked,
as he pushed himself up from a leaning position on the wall in the narrow corridor outside of the woman's office. He indicated Miss Perkins's office. The young man had dark hair, with a slight curl to it, and he wore it long on top. His piercing blue eyes looked like they were issuing both an invitation and a challenge. Hermione smiled. "Yes, she's free. But you might want to give her a moment. I think she's finishing up her morning coffee, and she might be in a better mood afterwards." The man gave a light laugh. "Thanks, that's a big help," he said, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "And if it means the chance to chat up a pretty girl, I've got no complaints." Hermione gave him an embarrassed smile as she blushed. Was he also a wizard? He wasn't familiar to her, but people came from all over the world to go to Oxford University. "I'm sure there's plenty of pretty girls around. It's only the first day of term." She moved left to go around the man, but at the same time he moved to his right to let her pass. They stood awkwardly, face to face, before laughing, then both moving to the other side of the corridor. He put out his hands, holding both her shoulders and taking a pivoting step around her. "Allow me." Her shoulders tingled slightly at his touch. It wasn't the tiny zing of magic one might expect from the touch of a witch or wizard, but she definitely felt a thrill. She cocked her head to the side. "Do you by chance know how to get to Diagon Alley?" she asked, pretending confusion. His brow wrinkled in ignorance. "Is that one of those little lanes off of Cornmarket?" "Possibly. No bother. I'm sure I'll find it," she said lightly, offering him a parting wave as she hurried up the corridor towards her first class. Tuesday, October 11th, 1999. Her first week and a half of classes had gone quite well. In her magical courses, she was able to use her quick-quotes quill to commit the professor's words to parchment. She aimed for the same level of achievement in her Muggle classes as well. At the start of the second week of coursework in each class, initial assessments were administered to every student. They were to serve as a benchmark for their early progress, as well as an indicator of how well they would fare for the rest of term. She had revised as much as she could for them in preparation. The hours spent taking these examinations had been grueling and nerve-wracking, but she felt confident in her performance. Hopefully, her scores would reflect that, but it would be some time until she received her grades. Back in her bedroom, after the last of the assessments was done, Hermione dropped to her bed in exhaustion, pleased to have them finished. She rolled to her side, her eyes catching upon the photographs on the windowsill. Her gaze slid quickly past the ones of herself with Harry and Ron from fourth year at Hogwarts. Those days were in the past, for now. She would not trade away those happy memories, but for now she needed distance from Ron. Rather, her focus was on the photos of her family. In one of her favourite photographs, her cousin Jonathan, 7 years her senior, crouched on the ground with her own family dog, Novocaine. The sight of it dredged up so many bittersweet memories for her. Jonathan had been the baby of the family until Hermione arrived. It was a title that the 7-year-old little boy was happy to pass on, as it meant that he would have to endure fewer cheeks being pinched and kissed, oohs and ahs over how much he had grown, and comments about how adorable he was. Jonathan's much older sister, Elise, had gone abroad to Canada for university, and had stayed there, breaking their mother's heart. Aunt Lucille never failed to remind her sister Linda of Elise's betrayal. When Linda and Richard announced that Hermione would be attending an exclusive boarding school in Scotland, Lucille had warned Hermione's mother Linda that one day Hermione might follow in Elise's footsteps. Linda had dismissed these admonitions as ludicrous, not knowing what would come only 6 years later. In his youth, Jonathan had always come for a week to the Granger house in summers. He took young Hermione and Nova to the park. the latter pulling at her lead to get them there faster. Sometimes they would walk to the Sainsbury's, a few blocks away, for a cold drink and some sweets. He loved dogs, even though his mother Lucille was allergic. Hermione's father, Richard, often joked that Jonathan really came to see Nova each summer. The photo on Hermione's windowsill had been taken during Jonathan's last summer visit, at age 20. He'd only come for the day instead of a week this time. Nova was getting to be quite old by then, but today she jumped around like a spry young pup again as they walked to the park. "How's school treating you, Meanie?" Jonathan had asked, using his old nickname for her, from when he'd been too young to pronounce Hermione correctly. Hermione was 13, and had only just finished her second year at Hogwarts. She was bursting to share everything, regretting that she could tell him next to nothing. Not about magic, or about her petrification. Not a single word of the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, or of Voldemort. "I love it. My classes are so interesting and challenging, and my friends were really there for me this year," Hermione said. "What about you? How are you liking U of Portsmouth?" Jonathan's smile lit up his face. They had reached the edge of the park now, and he reached down to remove the lead from the straining Nova's collar, so that she could run to her old heart's content. "It's wonderful. I met a girl." "Just the one? I figured there'd be dozens there, at least," she joked. He narrowed his eyes at her playfully. "There are, but this one is special. Her name is Michelle. Don't tell my mom or Aunt Linda, but I'm going to marry her one day." Hermione squealed with delight and threw her arms around her favorite cousin. "Jonathan, that's brilliant. When can I meet her?" His shy grin overtook his whole face. "Hopefully soon. She and I are applying for a summer abroad in Brisbane for next year. It will be the chance of a lifetime if we get it." The following summer, after her third year, Jonathan's postcards from Australia enthralled Hermione. The next summer he wrote to tell her about his new job. He loved it, but it took up all of his time and prevented him from visiting London that summer at all. She wrote back to him. It had been an eventful school year, and her worries about Harry preoccupied her. "Dear Jonathan, I'm so glad you're enjoying your new job. I'm sorry you won't be able to visit this summer. I'll miss you, but hopefully we'll get to see each other this Christmas. Dad and Uncle Spencer plan to rent a chalet in France. I'm trying to imagine your mum on skis. Hopefully Elise and Brian can come from Winnipeg. I haven't seen her in so long. Perhaps we'll get to meet your Michelle as well. School this year was rather eventful. We hosted a tournament competition, and one of my good friends, Harry, was allowed to compete in it. The tasks were rather difficult, but somehow he was declared the winner. The year certainly had its low moments, though. Plenty of sadness. Hopefully next year is better all around. Another sad bit of news. Our beloved Novocaine passed away earlier this year. Dad says she began to stay in her little bed all day around Easter, and she stopped eating. He and Mum were there with her when she went. Nova lived a good life, and I know that was in no small part because of you, Jonathan. With love, Hermione. Her 5th year at Hogwarts had been difficult. Professor Umbridge made it a miserable place to be, and everyone was eager to leave for the Christmas holidays. Seeing her favorite cousin, Jonathan, was going to be the highlight of the break for Hermione. Instead, Ron and Ginny's family heartache drew her to stay in London to support them. Arthur Weasley was barely clinging to life in St. Mungo's after the snake attack, and his family was bereft. Ron wrote to her that Harry seemed to be avoiding everyone. Hermione knew that Harry likely blamed himself somehow. He was good at that. So she stayed behind in London, whilst her mother and father flew to Strasbourg. Her entire extended family enjoyed the ski trip to the Vosges Mountains without her. She hated missing the chance to see Jonathan especially, and to meet Michelle, but she knew that she would see him the following summer. Jonathan and Michelle ended up staying behind for an extra weekend in France. Lucille told the family later that he was planning to ask her to marry him that weekend. No one knew if Jonathan had gotten around to asking Michelle for her hand in marriage before the accident. The paramedics said that Michelle had not been wearing a ring, and it wasn't in their things back at the hotel either. A surprise warm spell, followed by a hard freeze, created black ice on the roadways in the outskirts of La Bresse. Jonathan had not been able to steer away as the large truck barreled into their small rental car, killing them both instantly. Aunt Lucille, who already felt abandoned by her daughter, had now lost her son as well. And though Linda never said a thing to Hermione, the witch knew her own mother felt abandoned by her in their grief. With OWLs and Dumbledore's army and the difficulties created by Professor Umbridge, Hermione had elected not to leave school for Jonathan's funeral. More and more, the Grangers felt her pulling away from them, and closer to the wizarding world. Umbridge was no longer a problem by the end of the school year, and Mr. Weasley made a full recovery, for which Hermione was thankful. But her mind went often to that day in the park with Jonathan and Nova, years before. She wished that she had known then that it would be her final day with Jonathan. For her, the photograph was both a comfort and a harsh reminder of everything she had given up for this life. Her absence at Jonathan's funeral had been a turning point in her relationship with her parents. When she went home after her 5th year, still recovering physically and mentally from the errant spell cast by Dolohov in the Department of Mysteries, neither Linda nor Richard could understand why she would want to return to Hogwarts for her 6th year. They asked her to stay in Hampstead, but she needed and wanted to return. Bitterly, they let her go. When 6th year ended, she'd gone home heartbroken, still reeling from Dumbledore's death and from the gravity of her own decision to leave school and go with Harry on his hunt for Horcruxes. In her final days at Hogwarts, she had formulated an escape plan for her parents based vaguely on those dreamy, long-ago postcards from her cousin Jonathan. She'd written briefly to Richard and Linda, explaining the dangers they faced and her plans to hide them. She encouraged them to take the necessary steps to that end, such as shuttering the dental practice and sorting what they'd like to bring with them into hiding. That first night home, her parents instead informed her of several decisions that they had made. Hermione would not be returning to Hogwarts in September. They insisted that she finish her schooling at Highgate, the local school. Hopefully she would be able to take her A-levels, despite having not taken her GCSEs. They also insisted that she cut off contact with her friends at school. If the wizarding world was truly as dangerous for them as Hermione said it was no place for her either. Hermione listened stoically, nodding along in apparent agreement. She gave them both a hug and a kiss before retiring to bed. But she did not sleep at all that night. Instead, she removed from her extended bag the books that she'd taken from Dumbledore's office, the ones that dabbled in dark, questionable magic. Within their pages, she located the spell she needed, the one that she had marked, just in case. She practiced the wand movements and the incantation until they were perfect. Then she packed her beaded bag with everything she would need, and vanished every trace of herself that she could find in their home. Everything personal in her bedroom, every photograph that included her image. She vanished the mug in the kitchen cupboards that said "Number 1 Mum," as well as her father's beloved gardening t-shirt that read, "I'm my daughter's favorite." She vanished the markings on the kitchen door jamb, that marked her height during her years growing up. Soon after the sun came up, Hermione went downstairs to find her parents watching the morning news report on the telly. They'd been facing away from her, for which she was thankful. She wasn't sure that she could have raised her wand to their faces. When the spell was done, she hurried out of the front door on tiptoe, leaving Monica and Wendell Wilkins to seek out their new lives without the burden of a daughter. Hermione had always planned to reverse the spell, of course. With this, as with all magic, she was meticulous in her research, and had memorized the counter-spell. But that had not mattered to Richard and Linda Granger. 1 year later, when she travelled to Brisbane and found the little florist shop that they ran, they greeted her kindly, as they did every customer. But after the reversal spell was cast, a part of her could not help but wish that she had never come, that she had simply left them there, to their blissful ignorance. Her mother, her sweet mother, who had never had a cross word to say against anyone, had screamed and cursed at her angrily before storming off out of the tiny shop. Hermione stood in shock, hardly wanting to meet the eyes of Richard Granger where he stared at her from behind the register. The little bells above the doorway tinkled again, and both of them looked up, hoping, or perhaps dreading, Linda's return. But it was a couple of older ladies, coming in for flowers to bring to their ill friend in hospital.
"If you'll excuse me, I have customers that need help," Richard said stiffly.
"Dad, I'm so sorry," she began, but he cut her off quickly, not even looking at her.
"Mrs. Dorcas, Miss Eastleigh, lovely to see you both. Is Mrs. Zimmerman still ill, poor thing?"
Hermione recognized the jovial tone that her father had always used with his patients in the dental practice. His voice was a melody to her ears, after a year of thinking she might not ever hear it again. She only wished that he'd spoken as kindly to her, even if she understood and even expected his anger. Removing a bit of notepaper from her jacket pocket, she wrote, "Hermione, Royal on the Park Hotel, room 417. She placed this next to the register and left. Her father's eyes never left his customers. The next day, the floral shop was shuttered with a sign announcing their indefinite closure. When she planted false identities in their minds, she'd given her parents a preternatural tendency towards privacy, in an effort to thwart any Death Eaters from finding them, had the war expanded beyond the United Kingdom. Therefore she had no way of finding their home address. She stayed in Brisbane for 3 more days, walking the city near the closed florist shop, in hopes of encountering them. On the 3rd day, when she returned to her hotel, the concierge gave her a note that had been left for her. She opened it eagerly there at the front desk, then immediately wished that she'd waited until she'd been alone in her room to do so.
"We are returning to England, to the lives you stole from us. Please, don't come to the house. You have broken our trust, and we don't wish to see you just yet. That was a truly cruel and sadistic trick you played. We thought we raised you better."
There had been no salutation, nor a valediction. Unbidden tears flowed down her cheeks as she read their words, to the second-hand embarrassment of everyone else in the hotel lobby. Back in her room, she took out the international portkey that she'd arranged, the one with which she'd hoped to bring her parents back to Heathsgate. Landing in an undignified heap behind Richard Granger's garden shed, she pushed her way through the undergrowth and the brush in the back of the house. The rear facade was mildewed from the overgrowth she could see even at this very early pre-dawn hour. A handful of spells had the garden and the exterior of the house sorted quickly. Entering the back door, she walked through and vanished the dust, scourgifying every surface.
She adjusted the muggle-repelling wards, and left the key hidden in its usual place under the flower pot. Preparing the house for them was the least she could do, she thought, as she disapparated from Heathgate. She landed on the stoop of 12 Grimmauld Place, not knowing where else to go. Once back at school, she wrote them a letter to say that the war was over, and that Voldemort had been defeated. She told them that she was finishing her education, and she apologized again for what she had done. Their only acknowledgment had been a postcard, depicting the Brisbane skyline, postmarked from Hampstead, and delivered to the post office in Hogsmeade. On it, her father had scribbled a brief message. "Received your letter. Thanks for info. Happy birthday." She swallowed back her tears at their brevity. It was to be expected, but it still hurt. She sent another letter at Christmas of 1998, along with a few presents, and another in the spring of 1999, after she'd been accepted to Oxford. She received back their typical tepid responses. Now, 10 days or so into the Michaelmas term here at Oxford, for easily the 1000th time, she longed for the kind of relationship she'd had with her parents years ago. Early on at Hogwarts, when she'd felt friendless, or whenever she found herself up against a seemingly impossible obstacle, she would detail the situation in a lengthy letter to her parents. Without fail, they would answer in kind. Richard and Linda always offered her solid reasoning and comfort. They had reassured her that she was worthy of friendship, that everything would be all right, and that she was quite bright and would do well in her classes. Now, enrolled at Oxford at the age of 20, a part of her still felt like that little girl, fighting to find her place in a foreign world, and needing to know that she had someone at her side that she could count on. She could no longer rely on Harry and Ron, or on Richard and Linda. Oddly enough, the one current constant in her life was by far the most unexpected. Draco Malfoy. Ah, Malfoy. She rolled to her back, staring up at the ceiling. There was a man of mystery, if ever there was one. He was so different, now, than he had been back in their early years at Hogwarts. One difference was obvious. Perhaps Malfoy had always kept this fact under wraps in his own bedroom at Hogwarts, but she was learning that the man was incredibly messy. To be honest, it didn't fit in with the fastidious perception she'd always had of Draco Malfoy, and she found it rather unsettling. But it wasn't so unusual for people who had grown up in structured circumstances to want to break free once they were on their own. Draco deserved the right to explore his own personality, sow a bit of wild oats, just as everyone else did, she supposed. Hermione only wished that exploring his own personality didn't involve so much rubbish finding its way onto the floor of their flat. When she'd first begun living with Draco just over 1 year ago, she found him so overbearing, almost miserable to be around. He seemed so judgmental towards her and everyone else in those early days back at Hogwarts in their 8th year. But over time, she'd come to recognize that this gruff exterior was really more of a way of protecting himself. And, truth be told, he was trying to be more friendly. His manner might come off as standoffish or even aggressive at times, but she could see that, like her, he did not have many other friends. When it came down to it, Draco had been a good friend to her in a lot of ways. Not only had he advocated for her with the admissions and accommodations mix-up, he had become the sort of confidant that she'd missed in the last year. Their conversations over the tiny kitchenette table at Hogwarts had already continued here at Oxford, something that she was more pleased with than she wanted to admit to herself. Still, she knew who Draco was.
Yes, there were pure-blood members of the Sacred 28 who saw past things like blood status and birth. Neville, Kingsley, Theo, Ron and his parents, to name a few. But Draco's personal and family history had not been like theirs. She wondered if he was up for the challenge of ignoring the expectations set for him. He would eventually be expected to court and wed a pure-blood wife, and raise his heirs as he had been raised. Draco might be trying to find himself now, but ultimately he would still have to live up to the name of Malfoy. It made Hermione inexplicably sad to think of the wizard having to marry a stranger. Then she laughed to herself. What was she even thinking about? Wondering about the type of woman that Malfoy was going to date and marry. What did it matter to her? It shouldn't. That's all there was to it. He was a friend, and that would need to be enough, she admonished herself. She doubted that he would ever want more, regardless of his casual and meaningless flirtations here and there in their final months at Hogwarts. But a part of her could not help the occasional daydream that she'd had of the two of them together. She smiled to herself, recalling the dream from several nights before, reliving her New Year's fantasies. The way that he'd leaned over her in the corridor, his hair falling into his eyes, the solid warmth of his chest beneath her cheek as he'd helped her to bed, and the tender moment when he'd removed her shoes and covered her with her blankets. No, who Draco Malfoy ended up with in life should not matter to her in the slightest. But in moments like now, when her thoughts ran away from her, she had to admit to herself that it did matter. It mattered a lot to her, maybe too much, and she really wished that it didn't. Thank you for listening to Who Gives a Fuck About an Oxford Comma by Great 78. If you enjoyed the story and would like to listen to more, please follow me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts by searching for Silver and Copper. Or you can find me under Great 78 on Archive of Our Own.